Welcome to the Voice of San Diego podcast. I'm Sara Libby, and this is a bonus episode. So earlier in the week on the podcast feed, we covered the news of the week, which a big part of which was Shirley Weber's bill AB 392, which would change the standards guiding police use of deadly force. It got a unanimous vote in the state assembly, and now it moves on to the state senate and to the governor. And this is an interview we thought would pair really well with that discussion. So we brought in Wes Lowery. He is a national reporter for the Washington Post, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage on collecting data on police shootings across the country. So here is my talk with Wes. So can you start off just by explaining a little bit about your big project for which you ended up sharing a Pulitzer Prize and kind of some of the takeaways from that work were?
Of course. And so I'm a national correspondent at the Washington Post. I've been at the Post about 5 years now. And I used to cover Congress and national politics. And I happened to have a bag packed and be ready to go to Missouri when the police shooting of Michael Brown happened in Ferguson, which was now almost 5 years ago, 5 years in August. And out of that coverage grew a real kind of crucial question, right? It was a different world. It's hard to remember 2015.
Things have changed a little bit.
A little bit, right? But for 2015, 2016, the biggest domestic news story was these questions around police shootings and police use of force and race in policing. And so at the Post, as we started thinking about how we were going to cover that in smart ways as 2014 turned into 2015, we really zeroed in on a specific question. How often do the police kill people? It started because we would, I'd be on the ground in Ferguson. I'd interview a bunch of protesters or activists or civil rights attorneys, and they'd say, this is an epidemic. Black men are being killed every day. And being a good reporter, I'd call the police union. I'd call the police, and they'd go, we never kill any black people. We don't know what those people are talking about. And so smart editors and activists would say, well, which of those things is true? Either there's an epidemic of police shootings or they never happen. And as we started calling police departments and secretaries of state's offices, it became very clear that there wasn't any accurate data about how often police shootings were happening. And so we launched the Fatal Force Project to try to figure out what the answer to that question was. How often are people being shot and killed by the police in America? And then who are those people? What are the circumstances under which they're being killed? What we found was that this thing that the police said was almost never happening was in fact happening every day. That 3 people every single day in America are shot and killed by a police officer, which is a frequency far more often than we would have been led to believe previously. That results in about 1,000 victims of fatal shootings every year. What we then saw were the large number of white victims who were being killed. How often these shootings involve people who are armed. How often they involve people in the midst of some type of mental health crisis or drug and alcohol addiction, which was made up somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of all of the fatal shootings. But what we also found was that it was true that black victims were being overrepresented in these numbers, that black men, who make up about 6% of the U.S. population, make up something like 24% of the police shooting victims and 40% of the unarmed shooting victims. And so it started to speak to these realities and these frustrations being expressed in the streets. And so we did that project in 2015. Our online database continues in real time. We track fatal police shootings in real time. And so you could go on the Washington Post right now and see how many people have been shot and killed thus far in 2019. We still get a ton of traffic around that project because people are genuinely interested. And while initially a lot of police groups were kind of like, why do you want to do this? This is going to be anti-police to try to count this. Most people now accept that this is vital information. Everyone wants to live in a world where the police don't kill people, but how do you get to that world from a policy standpoint if you don't even know what is precipitating these shootings?
Yeah, it's been kind of really interesting to me to see the resistance even to the collection of data, which we've seen here in California. This local lawmaker, who we're going to talk a lot more about, Shirley Weber, also passed a law in 2015 that requires police to collect data about who they pull over to, try to establish whether racial profiling is even a thing that exists, and how can we combat this problem if we don't even know what the scope of it is. And even just the resistance to that has been kind of crazy to watch. So when you add in the factors of, death, I can only imagine what some of the reactions to that has been.
We would have people, and very often it would be kind of like far right-wing conservative types or bloggers, and they would go, see, I got you. I've proven the bias of this because, and they would bring up an example, for example, of like a terrorist who had attempted to hijack an airplane, and the police show up and kill him. Why is he in your database? And I'd go, well, did the police show up and shoot and kill him? And well, but he's a bad guy. I was like, well, but the point here of this database of everyone shot and killed by the police is in fact to figure out who everyone shot and killed by the police are. And so in order to understand perhaps an incident that feels more suspect or with an unarmed victim, you have to put that in the context of these other shootings where perhaps the police did the only thing they possibly could have done in this scenario, or it was the right decision to make. And so there's a ton of resistance. It's remarkable to think about in the time that we live in, with these little computers we carry around in our hands and our pockets all the time, all the data we are creating and we have available, that so much law enforcement and criminal justice data is still so lacking. There's so much we don't know about the world we live in. And you think about it, public safety is one of the most important public policy areas. So we have all types of people win and lose elections based on it. We spend millions, if not billions of dollars at the municipal level every single year on issues of public safety. And yet there's still such resistance sometimes to even just counting basic things so that we can make smarter policies.
Right. So let's talk about some of those policies. So I mentioned Shirley Weber. She's a lawmaker from San Diego. And we've been talking a lot about a bill that passed the Assembly this week. It's kind of fortuitous that you're here. You can talk about it with us. And it would change the standards guiding police use of deadly force. So in California, those standards haven't been updated since the 1870s. So it makes it the oldest use of force policy in the nation that's been untouched. Under the current law, an officer can legally use any kind of force they believe is reasonable to effect an arrest, prevent escape, or to overcome resistance of a suspect. So that means it's regardless of the crime they're suspected of committing, regardless of whether they're armed or whether they pose a threat to the officer or another person. So it's a pretty broad standard. It's broader than the Supreme Court standard has laid out. The new standard, if the law, is signed by the governor, would change it so that an officer can only use deadly force necessary in defense of human life. So it kind of adds an immediacy to it. It would also allow prosecutors to take into account the actions of the officer and the victim leading up to the shooting. So I wanted your perspective on whether you think this standard, if it had been in place in any of the shootings that we've seen across the nation, any that you've covered, do you think it would have changed the discussion around any of those shootings? Would it have impacted any of the way they were handled after the fact, do you think?
Well, and you all and others have done really excellent coverage around this issue because it's kind of wonky, but also extremely important, right? Changing even just those words from the objective reasonableness standard to the necessary standard is a massive legal shift in how you govern police use of force and deadly force, and really might change some outcomes, and certainly will change the way police train and instruct themselves. I've been watching this play out in California with a lot of interest because California in many ways will lead the way if this passes, and it'll be interesting to see what it looks like across the country. And this is the type of change in law that a lot of people in the criminal justice reform space have thought about and thought might be necessary. When we look at most uses of deadly force currently, under the current laws and use of force policies across the country and the current Supreme Court state law or Supreme Court precedent, almost every single use of force by a police officer is legal.
Right. Almost
none of them are prosecutable, right?
Absolutely.
That is a subjectively reasonable, and then you end up getting to the fear for your life standard, right? If the officer actually fears for his life, would it be reasonable for him to or her to use force, right? And almost every one of these cases, because it relies on the head, what's happening in the head of the officer, it's impossible to then disprove this negative, right? What this would change is it starts to zoom out and allow you to analyze, like at Sports Center, the interaction in a way that's different, right?
Yes.
And so you're now no longer looking at, well, can this person make an argument that they were reasonably scared and therefore could do whatever they wanted, but rather saying, okay, but objectively, should they have done these things that they're doing? So, for example, I've been spending a lot of time in New York. The officer, Daniel Pantaleo, who was involved in the Eric Gardner case, is currently facing an administrative trial about whether or not he will be fired for the potential chokehold used in that case. And This is a case where, and we've watched the video, we've seen it, right? This is a case where the local grand jury declined to prosecute him, where the federal grand jury hasn't announced what they will do, but it seems very likely they will decline to prosecute him. But this is a case where you have Eric Gardner is suspected of committing any violent crime. He is certainly not immediately complying. He's saying he doesn't want to be arrested, but he's not attacked officers. He is not, and Officer Pantaleo attempts to grab him from behind, ends up jumping on his back, wrapping his arm around his neck in what is being debated if it's a chokehold or not, bringing him to the ground, and keeps his arm there as Gardner says he can't breathe 11 times. That might be a case where it certainly would never meet the objective reasonableness standard, right? That the officers' behaviors there can be argued they are objectively reasonable. Were they necessary? I think there's a very strong argument that they were not. That the officer didn't need to use any force against Eric Gardner, much less that type of hold. And so that could be a case where, under a different standard like that, perhaps now you see criminal charges being brought.
Yeah, and it would be very hard to argue. I would think that Gardner presented an immediate threat to himself or others. Actually, under this law, posing an immediate threat solely to yourself would not give officers, allow them to shoot. The case that comes up for me when I think about these new laws and this new standards is the Tamir Rice case, in which, the officer just sort of rolled up so quickly and immediately. There was no announcement, there was no warning, there was nothing like that. And so I wonder whether, that might be a situation in which, they react so quickly and don't attempt to give any warnings, don't attempt to de-escalate the situation in any way. Not that there was much to de-escalate in that case.
Sure. And that one remains a little hard because that becomes one of the cases where perhaps the use of force itself still doesn't remain criminal, but there raises an additional question about the other tactics that are used. So it was hard, and I'll never forget this. When our first story in Fatal Force in 2015. We had a quote from Ron Davis, who works for the Department of Justice but used to be the police chief in Oakland. And he talked about how a lot of these are training issues, even beyond criminality, right? And he gives this anecdote where he goes, too often our cops are chasing people through 3 backyards, over a fence, landing on top of them, then a gun falls out, and now I'm scared there's a gun and I have to shoot this person, right? In the Tamir Rice case, what's difficult is they have placed themselves so close to where he is because of the tactics they use, that now, sure, any movement, whether it's actually threatening or not, may reasonably lead them to think he's reaching for the gun they maybe think he has, right? And so it's still, even in that case, I think it might still be difficult, even under a necessary argument. But I do think that this is a part of a conversation. I mean, the entire idea that we can now look in the totality of circumstances, as opposed to just in the actual moment of force, right, completely changes the way. Game changer. It completely changes the way these cases would be adjudicated.
Yeah. So stepping back a little bit, you wrote a piece about a year ago, I think, that I found really compelling, where you sort of pondered why police shootings had kind of fallen out of the public consciousness a little bit. Obviously there are some that still penetrate. The Stephon Clark shooting in Sacramento really helped propel this bill, AB 392, forward. But overall, it does feel like there's less appetite maybe for these to be kind of a top issue the way they were with Michael Brown, Philando Castile. Do you still think that's the case about a year or so out, and what do you chalk up to that?
I certainly think it's the case. I mean, I think it is both too easy and also accurate in some ways to blame the current presidential administration for that. And I don't mean, it's not like I necessarily think they really care if these stories are in the news or not, but they generate so much Washington-related news that I think our news cycle is incapable to focus on some of the things we were focused on previously. It's not that the police have stopped killing people. It's not that the shootings have stopped happening. It's not that they're no longer being captured on cell phone footage. It's that we've turned our eyes to any number of other things. And so it's hard for us sometimes collectively, and it's big media very often. I think these conversations are still happening at the local levels, but when we think about the stories that are in the headlines, we're basically thinking about what cable news is talking about all day, and what people with these huge platforms are using or are boosting. And right now, all of that is about what's happening at the White House or around the White House, and now the upcoming presidential, and very little about a lot of other things happening. And so police shootings, I think, and police violence in general are things where I think that we'll eventually when this administration cycles over to another one, whether that be next year or 5 years from now or whenever that happens to be, I think a lot of us are going to exhale and think back to like, all right, what are the things we haven't paid any attention to for 5 years? I think about this all the time.
Long list.
It will be. And I used to get emails in 2014, 2015, or people when I do like book talks, and people would say, "So why'd the police start killing so many people this year or last year?" Right? And I was like, "No, that's not what it was. We just started."
I'd say it's adorable, but it's also
sure,
terrifying.
but no, you just started paying attention,
right?
And so these are problems that pre-existed, kind of the Black Lives Matter era that we existed in, and will continue to exist once we exhale and perhaps are out of constitutional crisis and go, "Oh wait, so who are the thousands of people who've been victims of police violence in the time that we were focused on the other stuff?"
Here's hoping.
Let's hope.
So we recently saw a pretty devastating attack just down the road in Poway. A young man opened fire in a synagogue, killing one person. He's also accused of setting fire to a mosque nearby. Do you think that local law enforcement agencies are equipped to handle this threat of, individuals who are radicalized online? Is there anything they can do to, proactively monitor these types of situations?
It's really difficult. And this is actually a question I've been trying to probe in a line of reporting I'm still been working on is, what should the law enforcement response be? We know that in the year since Barack Obama was elected, we've seen an uptick in this type of domestic terror and right-wing violence, whether it be attacks on synagogues, mosques, anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim attacks. And in the Trump years, it's skyrocketed even beyond that, right? What's difficult is that we know that this functions like terrorism. People are radicalized very often on a certain set of websites and certain sets of forums. They receive certain types of propaganda. They exist in these kind of small social spheres, and eventually people go off the deep end and carry out attacks. Now, unlike a foreign terror group, where there's all types of infrastructure in the law. If we think ISIS is radicalizing someone in your mom's basement, we know how we have law enforcement mechanisms to monitor them, to flag them if they've been going to certain websites, to track them, to set up stings, to do this intel. Domestic terrorism doesn't function that same way, in part because these people are American citizens very often, because these right-wing or white supremacist groups are not, in fact, declared enemies of the United States or declared terrorism groups, which changes the ability you can do, whether it be to monitor or to investigate. And so I do think I do certainly think this is something that local law enforcement agencies have to be aware of and thinking proactively about, but also this is a space where the federal government does need to lead the way, whether it be through advocating for some changes in some of the legal mechanisms in terms of how we look at and how we consider domestic terror, but also in terms of prioritizing. The law enforcement in the United States of America works at a local level. There are 19,000 police departments that get to do what they want to do. But there really is power of purse and power of platform. When the Attorney General of the United States says this is a priority, this is what we're working on, this is what we're giving our grants out for, this is what at our policing conferences we're going to be talking about, that does trickle down to the sheriffs and the police chiefs and the SWAT teams and what we have not seen, certainly not in this administration, has been a focus from the highest levels on these threats, these domestic terror threats, and the rhetoric that has permeated a lot of our politics, I think only encourages some of this type of behavior.
I want to circle back to AB 392 maybe so we can just bookend this discussion. One of the reasons it was so kind of shocking and such a big deal last week when law enforcement groups signed off on an agreement was because, I've been covering the state legislature for maybe about 4 years now. And like I said, I've seen them oppose efforts to collect data. I've seen them oppose efforts to standardize body camera release policies. I've seen them oppose efforts to, anything around racial profiling. And even just this week at the local level, a watchdog group came out with a set of proposed reforms for the police that they've been working on for years. And one of the members of that group said immediately, I don't expect any of these reforms to be implemented. And it was just sort of like, well, maybe the discussion's over before it began. Have you seen successful efforts to sort of engage law enforcement in the need for reform or the appetite for reform? And what does that look like? Because I haven't really seen much of it.
Sure. And I think there have been successful efforts. I think I think there are layers to the work that happens here. there are a set of chiefs and sheriffs and law enforcement brass executives who are on board, who talk the talk, who kind of get it and who understand it. That's step one. Getting their line officers on board is an entirely different step after that, right? And that can be much more complicated. Getting the unions themselves on board, that comes way after that, right? And so there are some examples, but it does speak to the difficulty here. I mean, I referenced earlier, there 19,000 police departments. And what that means is that you have to fight the same battles over and over and over and over again. It's not like American law enforcement learns a lesson and now the lesson is learned. The lesson has to be learned here and there and here. One of the examples I always use is that I want to say it was the 70s, maybe 76, the New York Police Department did a full review of all its fatal police shootings. They were killing too many people. There had been a few controversial shootings. Should we change a policy? And what the NYPD did is it made a unilateral ban on shooting into moving vehicles. They realized a ton of their shootings were they're chasing some robbers or whoever, guy jumps into a car, drives off, they open fire. Well, best case scenario is that only one officer opens fire, and they only shoot one time because they're great shots, of course, and they immediately incapacitate the driver. They hit no one else in the car. And as he's being shot, the driver takes their foot off the gas and maybe applies it to the brake even. Well, we know that's never what happened, right? What ended up happening is you have four officers, they surround a car that is moving, end up shooting at each other, much less the brownstones behind them. And so you have bullets flying into apartments, the kids playing double dutch are getting hit, or they hit the other people in the car, or maybe they even do hit the driver, and then the car runs over the kids playing double dutch. And so when NYPD instituted this policy, they went from shooting and killing triple digits to the levels they are at now, where the NYPD has maybe 24 police shootings a year, right? This was seen clearly as a best practice. It was a kind of thing that limited the number of innocent bystanders being shot and killed, or inadvertent shootings, officers shooting themselves, sympathetic fire. And yet in 2016, there are police departments where the chiefs attempted to implement this type of policy. It's a time when there's massive protests, people are talking about it, people are reviewing the policies, and they said, hey, NYPD for 40 years has had a policy in the books, and these chiefs would get attacked by their police unions for trying to do this thing that had been proven for decades to work. It's the local politics in every single place are so sensitive because of the way we run our policing, and it's hard to see how you have massive, widespread change absent some type of change to the way that works structurally.
Wes Lowery, thank you so much for stopping by.
Of course, anytime.
Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of the Voice of San Diego podcast. I'm Sara Libby. If you haven't seen it already, you can check out my newsletter. It's called What We Learned This Week. It comes out every week on Sundays, and there's a link for that in the show notes. Thanks for listening.